Tale of Custom represents a maiden voyage of our research and composition. The first poetic work we read was Dictionary of the Khazars by Milorad Pavic, an amazing set of 2 volumes that reaches unprecedented poetic heights. The curious thing about Dictionary of the Khazars is that it contains prose rather than verse. Combining speculative fiction with elements of magical realism and poetry, it follows an ancient fictional people known as the Khazars and contains no easily discernible plot in the conventional sense of the word. The 2 volumes are identical save for a single critical passage close to the conclusion. Our quest, then, in modeling poems after Pavic was to discover the intersection between verse and prose. In writing Tale of Custom, I sought to present a world whose narrator offered no explanation for its strangeness, nor gave the reader time to question its laws and customs. The most difficult aspect of writing this poem was integrating poetic elements into what otherwise would have been prose. I attempted to make a poem out of a fictionalized historical account by diverging from the typical format of a story, refusing to explain the most absurd elements of the poem, and working at all times to provoke both an emotional response and a sense of unreality. The way I think about it, poetry can either be didactic, fantastically emotional, or above all, a blank canvas with which to empathize. Tale of Custom seeks to evoke the best parts of each of these characteristics. Tale of Custom. As is custom in the world, that which one can never have will be hung before them like a skinned rabbit to tempt them, to see if the balance of life is right within them. In the winter of her 23rd year, Tally encountered a traveler carrying a sack of shame to her hut. When she saw him, she began to quiver. She knew that she would fail. As the traveler approached the hut with his wares to hawk, Tally saw that he was slight and beautiful. The wind leaned into him with every movement he made. He crushed the snow into gory blossoms and closed the distance between the 2 of them. When she caught his scent on the wrist of the breeze that had followed him, she nearly lunged forward to devour his heart. Solitude promised to render her hands from her body. If she violated its laws, it would curse her as she bled out into the snow around her hollow house and was eaten by the soil. When one has so much power, the world must own something of them too, both here and in the realm of the dead. Tally and the traveler haggled briefly over the price of his shame. When dawn came, his teeth had stripped her of her integument. Lightning strikes gashed the withering sky on the eve of Tally's birth. They were sufficient enough to tell of her growth in time into a woman of peculiar and swallowing power. One night some years after her first breath, swept up in the throes of monsoon season, her mother caught a nightmare in her eye. The hateful insect burrowed its way through the blood vessels of her face and plagued her with hallucinations of spiny fish and the sweet-smelling blood of miscarriages until she could not wake for fear of death. Wailing for hours, Tally scratched at her mother's face and begged her to wake, toddled around the brambled yard, and finally fell down senseless next to her quivering body. After some time, the rain began in full. In a single moment, 1,000 drops caressed Tally's arms and legs, gentling her and urging her to stand. She pressed her 4-year-old's hands into her mother's cheeks until they turned purple with the leached ailment. Her mother soon woke and realized who she had created, and her stomach wept acid bitterness. She knew that this innocent kittling of a child would never know companionship from the day she reached adulthood, and that she would be followed by hungry loam destined for her flesh until the day she died. Within days, Tally's tongue began to exhibit the signs of her difference. For example, on each 3rd morning, she took a different word from her voice box and crumbled it until it was small enough to sprinkle in the stew pot. She would eat her spiced breakfast ravenously and spend the rest of the day plumbing the depths of the dissolved word until she knew it as well as she knew the skin circling her fingernails. Under this action, words became like bottled sauces, and her mother disapproved. She remembered only too well her own childhood 100 years before, when words had balanced precariously on the precipice of extinction. But this venture pleased Tally, and her mother put up with it and allowed her daughter all of the breakfast and none for herself until she could slip away and eat an apple behind the house. Soon enough, Tally had bathed enough in the broken pieces of her own tongue to know that she had reached the cusp of adulthood. From then on, she knew her task, to journey away from her mother's house and become a night wanderer and bird harvester, traveling to and from the wood in which she would build her hut and drink concoctions of chickadee down and the dreams of trees to keep up her strength. She would bring knowledge to travelers in wicker cages and drink the disease from their bones and spit it back out again into jars to use later at a price to curse the unfaithful. She would be alive but never living, obtaining the power of the world, demanded that she hang one of her fingers from a yew tree as a sign of her contract. This finger would never be returned to her. Her only sense of uneasiness originated from the knowledge that she had not chosen this life. It had kidnapped her. From the moment the traveler lays Tally down on her bed of furs, her hut is battered with wind and earth from the inside out. When she and the traveler speak, though they speak little, they reassure one another that they have not killed themselves by falling into companionship. Her furs are warm again, and when she wakes in the middle of the night, she listens with growing recognition to the traveler's dreams as they gallop through his veins. Chickadee down and tree dreams. They eat and drink wantonly. Rain rattles against the hut. They shut themselves into each other, and he has hands the color of a sun hundreds of years away. But, like all impossible fables, Tally acquires love like a pox. The boy cannot see her in the night time, and so her sleepful days are soon replaced with the thrumming movement that agitates the loam hovering up under the turned-up edges of her life. Her passion and desire are like appalling explosions that burst wetly out of her mouth, and soon she cannot ignore the diminishing state of her solitude. In time, the traveler realizes he is gorging himself at Tally's expense and fasting at his own. Leaving her hollow house at the first sign of dusk, he sloughs his shame from his shoulders like a cloak. When he first appeared at her door, his shame was small and soft, the last remnants of some nearly forgotten fever dream. Now the cloak he wears at sunset whips like 1,000 willow trees in the wind. When he peels it apart at the market, he smells the ghost of Tally's skin, and notices fearfully that the scent changes day by day. His constant return thumbprints her more and more. His shame grows more and more. In this way, the traveler finds the means to remain with Tally. In this way, he dooms her. As is custom in Tally's world, joy and bitterness are bound, and one cannot exist without the other. The traveler sees his eyes reflected in hers. The loam reaches out a tongue to taste test her bare feet. The machinations of the forest, they become second nature to him. The earth rises where she walks. Her world, of which the traveler carries so little knowledge and affection, has become his own. Her hut of caged birds and bottled sicknesses calls to him. How strange it was at first, but now how dangerously familiar, so close is he to recognizing it as his home. Each coin he uses to survive in Tally's world reminds him that the hollow reserved for him in her bed is, in a way, purchased with his shame, and the natural consequence of this is her death. Each morning he comes and strips her of her clothes and redresses her with breathless wind, a garment of devotion, its cloying odor drenching them both with its capacity to destroy. Helplessly, he makes his living of her solitude. His hands shake. On their last day, Tally will sense the loam beginning to nibble at her. It will be this, more than her knowledge of laws, that lights a candle in the darkness to reveal her fast approaching death. When a woman of power condemns her task of solitude, no act of expiation will save her, and so, knowing oblivion is upon her, Tally will send a kestrel to call the traveler to her. He will come to her in panic, having smelled his faults mixed with hers on his most recent wares. She will draw him close to her at once and whisper quietly, licking his weeping palms and blowing the light of her fire into his heart like a squirming nest of worms. He will bury himself in her furs and cover his ears to deafen himself from her rendering, knowing himself to be bound forever in this world without mercy. Then, feeling the first cold bite of the loam upon her heel, Tally will flee into the woods to the tree bearing her finger, placing it in her mouth so that when she dies she will not remain fettered to the earth. She will bite her tongue. The sharp release of blood will strike the dead leaves under her and set the loam loose. Then, her spite lying cold between her teeth, the loam will gorge itself on Tally's skin, hands, and stomach until nothing survives of her on the plant litter but a single crumbled word.